The global conference on climate change kicked off with some big promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
The United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade.
Our new climate target for 2030 is to reduce our 2005 emission levels by 40 to 45%.
Setting goals, though, is one thing, achieving them another, especially when it requires global cooperation. Critics say one country's sacrifices won't matter if another country continues to pollute. Opposition leader Aaron O'Toole says the Prime Minister's commitment will cost Canadian jobs.
Canadians can't afford higher and higher taxes. They can't afford to wipe out sections of our economy. That seems to be Mr. Trudeau's plan. Raise taxes and transition Canadians out of their jobs. I will not do that.
So how will Canada meet the new targets? Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
Nice to see you.
Minister, when will your government tell Canadians what it plans to do to reach this new target?
Well, I think we've already told Canadians the bulk of the work that needs to be done to achieve the target. As you will know, we worked on the Pan-Canadian Framework after 2016, which provided steps towards the target. And we then followed that up with a strengthened climate plan in December that provided visibility about how we get to 31% reductions. And then in the budget, we made a number of investments that get us to 36%. So that is perhaps one of the most detailed climate plans that exist in the world. But we're 9 years from 2030. We know the science is telling us that we need to do more alongside our partners like the United States. And so what we've said is we need to continue to do work, and we will need to have additional investments and do additional work over the coming 9 years to ensure that we can meet that target. But the vast majority of it is already done.
Well, so does that mean that the plan will kind of be laid out incrementally over the 9 years? And the reason I ask, I take your point that the vast majority is out there, but the investments you outlined to go from 31 to 36, for example, are worth $17 billion. So going from 36 to, let's say, 41% will also be substantive. Does it mean that, are you insinuating that basically that will be laid out incrementally over the next 9 years?
Yeah, I think what it means is that we will need to continue to invest. Climate change will need to continue to be a priority, both with respect to addressing the environmental crisis, but also with respect to ensuring that we're helping our companies transition to low carbon products and technologies that will enable them to be competitive in a very low carbon future. So yes, we will need to continue to ensure that climate change is a priority. I would just clarify the $17 billion in the budget, though, was not simply about climate change. A chunk of it was, but a big chunk of it was about conservation and nature. So,
okay, I take your point on that. I guess, and I understand what you're talking about, investments over the next number of years. I think the reason I ask for some sort of timeline where a plan is concerned is also when it comes to not just the investments you're going to make, but what happens to the oil and gas sector? Because we heard from a lot of experts today who said, look, you can't reach that more aggressive target without decreasing production, or at least not seeing continual increases in production in that sector. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, certainly we need to see reductions in emissions from the oil and gas sector, just like we need to do from every sector of the economy. And I would tell you a bunch of that work with respect to reducing emissions is already underway. So the methane-related regulations really start to come into force now. The Clean Fuel Standard, which is about reducing the carbon intensity of liquid fuels, will be coming into force over the next couple of years. Of course, the price on pollution will have an impact, as will some of the funds around things like biofuels. I mean, Suncor and Shell just invested in a big biofuels facility in Quebec. So those are a big part of it. But the other part is it is intimately also related to transportation. So the work we're doing with the Americans to try to accelerate the deployment of zero-emission technologies, the more that you can do that, the quicker that you can do that, you're going to tamp down the demand for oil.
I'd like to, though, just get a little bit more detail from you on the oil and gas sector specifically. When you say tamp down demand, do you expect, for example, in order to reach that goal that was announced today, that production in the oil sands will decrease over time?
Well, I think that our view is we can achieve that number through reductions that exist with respect to existing production. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the oil and gas sector with respect to methane emissions, with respect to CO2 that's emitted at large emitters that can be addressed through solvents and carbon capture and a whole range of other technologies. So, our focus is on making significant step change, but it's not just oil and gas. I mean, we have the same challenge with steel. We have the same challenge with cement. And so our approach is a comprehensive one that's looking to reduce emissions across the economy in every sector.
The reason I'm asking about oil and gas is because basically every piece of analysis I read today from either professors in the area or advocates in the area talked about how, for example, I think it's Professor Harrison, Catherine Harrison at UBC, even with the highest end of the carbon price, $170 a ton, emissions from the oil and gas sector are expected to be just 13% below 2005 levels. Even with your 2020 plan, the one you announced prior to the budget in place, the oil and gas sector will account for 27% of 2030 emissions. So, you're saying that basically production can remain where it is. Can it increase? Because when you talk about pipelines or when you talk about getting a better price for our product, as you hear the Prime Minister say and the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, that in general, if oil prices continue going the way they are, would mean higher production.
Well, I will tell you again, Vash, I mean, it's a function of two things. The first is the challenge to the oil and gas space, like every other space, is to reduce the emissions that come from the existing activities that they have. And as I say, I think there's an enormous amount of scope to reduce those emissions. But it's also about where the demand is on a global basis for oil. I mean, oil is a transportation fuel by and large. As you move aggressively to reduce, to essentially convert to electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, you will see a decrease in the demand for oil. That's just common sense. And so that's what we would expect to see. And certainly the faster that we can go on the rollout of electric vehicles, and that's part of the work we're doing with John Kerry and the Americans, the faster that you will see a transition.
So what happens to the workers who are affected by that transition? If in fact, as you point out, when demand goes down for the product, so will emissions and so will production in the sector. What happens to them, and why hasn't your government presented a more specific plan about a quote unquote just transition like you have for coal?
Well, and you correctly noted we have done that for coal because there was an explicit decision with respect to the phase out of coal. There's certainly a lot of work going on with respect to the transition with respect to energy and oil and gas, although I will tell you gas is perhaps a little bit different from oil in the sense that you can extract hydrogen from natural gas in a manner that you don't have carbon emissions. With respect to oil, there's certainly work that needs to continue to be done with respect to a just transition, to ensuring that people are set up for success, just as there is with respect to economic diversification, including potential applications for the use of bitumen. Like there's a lot of work going on in Alberta around carbon graphite and uses that you may be able to put that to. Those are exactly the challenges that we need to be addressing now as we go forward. Given that we've now raised the level of ambition, the focus going forward has to be as much on economic prosperity in every region of the country as it does on reducing emissions.
So simply then, when can workers in that field, let's even specify it to oil. I understand what you're saying about there being an explicit decision on coal. I don't hear any kind of explicit decision when it comes to oil. So in the absence of that, when can people who work in that sector, who listen to you tonight and understand that demand in that sector might be going down, when can they expect your government to present a plan that will ensure they have a job in 5 or 9 years?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say let's not overstate. This is a transition. It's going to be a transition that happens over the course of decades, not days. But the second is, yes, I mean, we certainly need to be working to ensure that we are creating jobs. And in Alberta, those could be jobs around the creation of hydrogen. They could be jobs around biofuels. They could be jobs around alternative uses for the oil that exists in that province. There is some things in the budget around skills training that relate directly to that, and that's something that certainly we're going to continue to work on over the coming few years. But
respectfully, it's not a huge amount of money, and when you say could be this, could be that, could be this, I put myself in their shoes, and I know you've worked in you've worked in those provinces as well. I'm sure you can understand their plight. They're listening to this thinking the future doesn't look so bright for us, and you're offering a lot of coulds. When might there be something more specific?
Well, I'm not sure I'm offering a lot of goods. I mean, what I have said is we need to certainly be working to ensure that we are helping Alberta to diversify its economy and Saskatchewan. Those are conversations that are active and ongoing with the government of Alberta and Saskatchewan in terms of how we do that. Certainly some of those jobs around hydrogen are very similar to the jobs that exist today. It's a transition that's going to happen over many years, and I think that we have demonstrated that that is something that we are very focused on ensuring is done in a successful way that sets Alberta, Saskatchewan, and every province up for success from an economic perspective in a low-carbon environment.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.
That's Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. Let's get reaction now from Canada's Green Party leader. Annamie Paul joins us from Toronto. Hi, Ms. Paul. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Vashi.
I know that you and your party had advocated for more aggressive targets. So what the government announced today was a range of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. Your party had established and advocated for a goal of 60%. The government's argument against that, and the minister's argument more specifically, is, targets are one thing, meeting them is another. Better to be realistic and actually meet targets than set these really aggressive ones that we won't. Do they have a point?
I simply cannot understand that logic at all, and I completely disagree with it. It is possible to set a strong target that meets our obligations that the scientific community has asked Canada to set, and also to meet it. And we've seen today that the US is not afraid of the challenge. The European Union has adopted a climate law this week. They're not afraid of the challenge. The United Kingdom isn't. And so we shouldn't be either.
What the government says in response to that is the makeup of their economies, let's say more generally, is different. And by that, their reliance, or the segment of the economy that is oil and gas, or that energy sector, is smaller. So they would have to do things, the measures they would have to introduce would not have to be as stringent in this country.
What I would say is that we have other countries, other developed economies around the world who are heavily dependent upon the oil and gas sector as a significant part of their GDP, that have made much more ambitious promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than we have made today. And it's very true that the successive policies of successive liberal and conservative governments investing further and further into carbon-intensive industries has led us to a place where we absolutely do have to do more than other countries in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the fact is that we do. And this was the time today to show some real leadership on that, and we really abdicated that responsibility.
And when you say do more, I do want to ask you what some of your suggestions would be in that vein. But first, when you say other jurisdictions that are as reliant on oil and gas, for example, as a portion of their GDP, have gained greater ground, which jurisdictions are those?
Well, so for instance, Norway has already chosen to end all offshore oil exploration. Their sovereign fund their wealth fund is pulling out of investments in the fossil fuel sector. So we can see that countries that are heavily dependent, and we also know in the case of the United States as well, the United States set a more ambitious target for themselves as well. A significant part of their GDP also comes from the fossil fuel sector. So that really is in and of itself not a reason not for Canada to have met its climate obligations and set a more ambitious target.
So what does it require then, from your perspective, when it comes to the sector, the oil and gas sector? And I think you were listening into the interview with Minister Wilkinson, in which I asked a number of times, like, in order to meet even the goals set out by the government, how much decreased production does there need to be? What do you envision for that sector? Like, what does it look like by 2030? It is difficult to get a specific answer, so I'll put the same question to you. By how much would production have to decrease in the oil and gas sector to meet the kinds of targets your party is advocating for, more aggressive than the ones laid out today?
Well, I don't have a specific number on how much production would need to decrease, but we know that it does need to decrease substantially. And we also know that we simply cannot afford to bring any new production online. And that means we can't have any new pipeline projects coming online. It means that we can't have any new projects coming online as a product of the oil exploration projects that the government just approved off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. It means that we can't continue to subsidize frack gas projects like the Coastal GasLink project. Those things we know that it means, because 26 to 20%, so 27% of our emissions come from the oil and gas sector. There is simply no possible scenario under which we could arrive at our climate targets, even the low targets that were set today, without dramatic reductions in our fossil fuel production.
So what does that mean for the people who work in those industries? And what, for example, would a government led by you do to ensure that those people watching tonight, like I said to Minister Wilkinson, who are hearing this and thinking the future doesn't look bright for me, ensuring that their future is better, that there is a job for them?
I want to speak directly to those people, Vashi, and say, you are our number one concern. You are the people that we are thinking about most when we think about why economic diversification is so necessary. There are interests that would take every single drop of oil out of the ground and then cut and run and leave communities high and dry. And we've seen that before with other extractive industries. We saw that on the East Coast when the cod fisheries died. And so, we are thinking about what is the future. And it's really exciting, Vashi. If we invest now in a green recovery, Alberta is the best place in the country for solar power. It has tremendous geothermal capability. The infrastructure that could be built there could make it a leader globally. And certainly a number of our leading clean tech companies in Canada are also based on the prairies. So if we want a future for those workers, and that is exactly what we want, and we don't want to see displacement, I would tell those workers, don't let yourself be strung along by people who are focused on the dollar and not on your future.
But respectfully, does that require an investment from government, let's say a government led by your party? Does it require a specific amount of money? Does it require more specifics than, this industry could be a big one in Alberta? Again, I just imagine them listening and thinking, that sounds great in theory, but I'm not seeing any of it in practice.
Absolutely. It requires very specific investments. I point out that this week, the EU didn't just say we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. They also said we're going to put 30% of our 1.8 trillion euro long-term budget behind that promise. So that's exactly what we need to do. Those are the dollars that it takes, but that investment pays off, Vashi. And so we did propose back in 2019, we laid out a very detailed plan for a just transition, part of it modeled after the plan that was executed in the coal industry. We laid it out, we costed it, and we talked about, which infrastructure we could invest in. We talked about which sectors we could invest in specifically out on the prairies so that they would be first in line. And that's really what this is about. You make no mistake, these promises today were about countries saying we are in a global race to lead the green economy and to take a big share of this multi-trillion-dollar economy, and we want to be first. And so Canada has a choice. If we want to be first, if we want to make sure that workers have jobs for the future, then this is where we need to go. And it's very exciting, Vashi. This really could set us up for the future if we get it right.
Okay, Ms. Paul, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Vashi.
Annamie Paul is the leader of the Green Party. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.